Sarah, can I begin now?
Yes, Shivan, go ahead.
A very good morning to all of you. I would like to welcome all the members of the audience, esteemed guest panelists, AuthorCafé team, and chairperson to the webinar on the role of electronic thesis and dissertation in furthering research in India. To begin the session, I would like to introduce our chairperson, Dr. Savita Iyer, who will be moderating the session today. Dr. Savita Iyer is the founder of Chakranda Tree, an independent consultancy service supporting organizations with their research management needs. Dr. Iyer received her initial training in biochemistry at the University of Delhi and biotechnology at AIIMS, New Delhi. She completed her doctoral work in developmental biology at the University of Cambridge, UK, supported by a Cambridge Commonwealth Trust Fellowship. Following a period of postdoctoral research at the University of Cambridge, UK, she moved to the Wellcome Trust in London, UK. Following this, she relocated to India to initiate and nurture the activities of the Research Development Office at the National Centre for Biological Science, Bangalore. She currently works on behalf of academic institutions, funders, and other stakeholders on problems relating to research management. She works in an advisory capacity with AuthorCafé to shape development of the AuthorCafé online platform uh, and our interactions with the research ecosystem in India and globally. I would like to request Dr. Iyer to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Shivan, for that warm introduction, and a very good morning to all of our participants, attendees who have joined in from different locations across the world. I'd like to thank AuthorCafé for convening this very interesting webinar on electronic theses and dissertations. It's a pleasure to be here amidst our very eminent panelists and colleagues and all our participants today. So I'd just like to start by taking a few minutes to share some housekeeping instructions. The panel discussion will take about 90 minutes, possibly a little bit more, and we will have time after that to take questions from the audience. So we request all participants to type in their questions into the Q&A box on the platform, and we'll take these questions for our panelists at the end of the panel discussion. All attendees will remain on mute during this session. And please do also share your thoughts and comments on this webinar. So if you're tweeting about the event, these are the hashtags, hashtag ETT webinar and hashtag AuthorCafé. We'd love to hear your thoughts about the webinar today. So on that note, I'd now like to say a few words of introduction to today's webinar. Research conducted by doctoral students forms an important part of the overall research output for India particularly. Our PhD scholars are among the brightest in the world and are the scientists, innovators, problem solvers, and leaders of the future. And the doctoral thesis is a very important milestone. It's also an output of the PhD journey. And the thesis contains all the data emerging from this large body of work. It represents a rich resource which could be very useful for future research. And as a community, how can we ensure that the content in our thesis can be accessed readily by colleagues all across the world, and both in the field and outside of the field? So as it happens, electronic theses and dissertations are emerging as a solution for enabling wider access to this content. But as with all such new interventions, this also poses its own very specific considerations and challenges. So in today's webinar, we are joined by a set of very eminent panelists who also represent different stakeholder communities playing a role both in research as an activity and in the dissemination, the open dissemination of research outcomes. And with our panelists today, we look forward to understanding the role of electronic theses and dissertations in furthering in research in the Indian context, and also some of the challenges surrounding the wider adoption of such resources, and what might the future be for the use of ETDs in India. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to now introduce our panelists for today. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Professor Girish Ratnaparki from ICER Pune. Professor Ratnaparki is an associate professor and he's also the Dean of Academics at ICER Pune. He obtained his PhD from the Molecular Biophysics Unit at the Indian Institute of Science, and after that period working on structural biology problems, he then carried out postdoctoral research at the National Center for Biological Sciences in Bangalore, and then at the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at UCLA in the US. He then relocated to India to join ICER Pune, and his research interests include understanding the mechanisms of cell signaling in animal development and disease using the fruit fly Drosophila melanogaster as a model organism. As I mentioned, Professor Ratnaparki is the Dean of Academics at ICER Pune, and he oversees the entire academic program there, which includes the BSMS course, an MSc program, and of course the graduate program. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Ratnaparki. We are also joined today by Professor Vijay Shekhar Chalaboyna, an academic leader and currently the Dean of Engineering at Geetham deemed to be a university. Professor Vijay received his BTech and MS in Mechanical Engineering at IIT Madras and the Florida Institute of Technology at Melbourne, USA. He received his PhD from the Georgia Institute of Technology at Atlanta, USA, specializing in mathematical theory of nonlinear control systems. And his research interests include stability theory and feedback control applications to complex systems, including biomedical and financial systems. He is also a very well-regarded educator. And before joining Geetham, Professor Vijay was a faculty member at the universities of Missouri and Tennessee and Mahindra University. He also served as the Dean at Mahindra University and at SRMAP University. He was also a principal scientist at TCS Research, heading the risk and finance groups. Welcome, Professor Vijay. Our third speaker today is Dr. Momita Kole from the DST Center for Policy Research at the Indian Institute of Science. Dr. Kole holds a PhD in organic chemistry from the Vienna Institute of Technology in Austria. She continued her research in the field of CH activation and metal and enzyme catalyzed reactions at TU in Vienna and later at the Indian Institute of Science here in Bangalore. And during her research career as an experimental chemist, she also became interested in science policy. She developed a strong connection to the philosophy of open science. And at present, she is a science, technology, and innovation policy researcher at the DST Center for Policy Research at ISC Bangalore. Her specialization is in open science and open innovation. Her research interests include science, technology, innovation policies, open access, open research, data, citizen science, and responsible research assessment. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. Kole. It is also a pleasure to introduce our fourth panelist for today, Dr. Sridhar Gutam. Dr. Gutam is a senior scientist at the ICAR Indian Institute of Horticultural Research in Bengaluru. He is also the convener of Open Access India, a community of practice promoting open access, open data, and open education in India. In addition to his research on plant physiology of agricultural crops, he is interested in open access to agricultural data and the use of free and open source software in agricultural research. He is an alumnus of Clasco's working group and is currently on the board of AgriArchive, India Archive, Thesis Commons, and Dryad. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. Gutam. And last but certainly not the least, we're delighted to have Dr. Danny Kingsley from Flinders University in Australia joining us here today. Dr. Kingsley is Associate Librarian, Content and Digital Library Strategy at Flinders University, and she's a visiting fellow at the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science. Between 2015 and 2019, she worked as the Deputy Director of the Cambridge University Library's Scholarly Communication and Research Services. She established the Australasian Open Access Strategy Group and worked at the Australian National University as Manager of Scholarly Communication after completing her PhD on Open Access. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Kingsley. And with those introductions, it's now time to get tucked in to the actual conversations with all of our panelists. So, Dr. Ratnaparki, I'd like to request you to open the webinar for us today and set the context. Um, so, have a question for you, which is that you're a life scientist, you're a mentor, you're the dean of academics, and please could you share with us your views on the significance of the PhD thesis for a PhD scholar, and also the significance of the thesis for the broader academic community. Over to you, Dr. Ratnaparki.
Thanks, Savita. I hope I'm audible and visible. I guess I am. So,
yes.
Yeah. So the question you have posed to me is a little difficult, and I'll end up giving a philosophical answer, which I don't think is going to make anybody happy. But I'll try. So I look at a thesis or the process of a student, a research student, going forward into solving a research problem as a sort of a microcosm of life itself. It's a very strange, as I said, philosophical statement. And a thesis is, in my mind, a kind of a diary. It's a very personal diary. I know that during the discussions, I'll be told that universities, institutes have very specific guidelines for how you write this diary. That's true. But it's still a very personal experience for each PhD student. And each PhD student is a kind of a, I would say, an apprentice scholar. And you transit from being an apprentice scholar to being a master of the subject by the time the thesis is done. Now, my experiences are very limited to experimental biology. I don't really have experiences beyond that. And it's a very rough road, as you know, and everybody who has a PhD knows. And you are kind of lost in the darkness for many periods, many time periods while you're doing your PhD. So as far as the research goes, the science goes, one focuses exclusively on a very niche area in your science. In my case, the students I mentored are doing biological sciences, and you go from being an apprentice, as I said, to a master. And for me, the mark of successful thesis is that the apprentice basically becomes a master, and by the end of the term of the PhD, which can be very long in the biological sciences, 5 years to 8 years, it's a fairly long period, you end up being an expert in your field. You end up gaining a lot of skills. You start by learning experimental tools, as an example, in the beginning. A very important phase of a thesis, according to me, is most students don't seem to understand what a research problem is. So when I was a student, I had no clue what a research problem is. And every time I mentor a student, well on into their third year, one of the most difficult parts to explain to a student is what exactly constitutes a research problem. And at some point, the student catches on what a research problem is. It's a very small niche area in which they focus in. They learn to define objectives, pick up tools, and somehow stumble in like a sheep lost in the meadow towards a direction where they learn a lot, and they solve a very small portion of the open problems which are there out in the field. And I guess that's it. That's pretty much what a thesis is. It's an exploration. It's a personal expression with the diary, and whatever little you produce. I know you use the term a large body of work when you introduced what a thesis was, but when you look at the vast universe of research out there, it's really a very small drop of water in the ocean. But as they say, many drops of water make an ocean. So each contribution is valuable. And since our topic for today is talking about open access, talking about electronic dissertations, the availability of this small drop of water is very important for humankind as a whole. And all efforts should be made that the importance of this small drop of water be there, and the small drop of water be available to everybody who's interested in the drop of water, because without having this knowledge, humankind per se cannot progress. So I'll just stop here and see if you have anything else you want me to add. Very philosophical, I'm sorry, but that's the way things are.
Oh, that's wonderful. I think that's a great start to our conversation. Thank you so much for that. And of course, this matters to the student, the person who's produced this small drop of water, and it matters to the community. So it's equally valuable on both sides. And since we're both life scientists, I have a question to you about the life sciences. This is an extraordinary time for us in life sciences. We have access to a huge number of technologies, many omics technologies, and all of these generate enormous amounts of data. So maybe could you comment a bit on that kind of data that is presented or available to the student? How can that be represented either in a thesis? Well, that's one part of it, but also made available to the community. Again, because the vastness of that, it's a very large scope.
Right. So I'll try and answer your question. It's not an easy question. There are some things which are very clear. I hope nobody in the panel or in the audience will disagree with me when I say that knowledge has to be available to everybody. Knowledge is power, and the power should go to the people, right? Now, how do you make the knowledge accessible, even if it is open access? That doesn't mean that. So, for example, a PDF file, it can be an open access file, but it's not easy to quickly go through a PDF file, follow the links, jump from one topic to another, using it as a stepping stone as an example. So I think there has been a good start in the sense that, again, I'm not an expert in data storage or data access, but when I look at the data available to me today as a researcher and to my students, most things are available for free, with the exception, of course, of paywall journal papers. But databases are really accessible. Genome databases, mass spec databases, sequencing databases. These are reasonably accessible. I'll go back to the drop of water analogy, and each of these is basically a drop of water. So as long as, some drops of water are 10 years old, some of them are 100 years old. And all of this, as time accumulates, as you move forward in time, when you look back, analysis of this old new data set in time really gives you a very clear idea of what is happening. It's more important to look at research in time rather than research just in a little slice of time. So what I'm trying to say is that I think we are on our way. I'd let the experts in the panel comment on how successful we are in making data available. But I think the direction is positive, and we just have to do more to make data accessible. I would really like, and this is a very small point, to have all. So when I look at journals, let's say the PLOS journals as an example, which is something which I am a little familiar with, they are moving away from their full text availability, is moving away from just being a PDF to being a clickable enterprise, where as you go through the paper, you can click on figures, you can click on supplementary material. So you seamlessly can jump from one piece of data to another. So I think click and move is probably what we need. The monster behind the click and move is something I don't understand, which the other experts will have to comment on. Sorry.
Thank you very much. That's, I think, a great start. So on that note, I will actually move on to Professor Vijay. And from life sciences, let's also hear from an engineering perspective. Professor Vijay, you are again a researcher, a mentor, and the Dean of Engineering. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on the thesis and what that means for students and also for the community at large. Again, another academic perspective on that question. Over to you, Professor Vijay.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Savita, for that question. Let us first, define in some sense what is a thesis, and then then I'll probably go into what I think is an ideal thesis, and then how it should impact or how it will impact, some sense of going forward in terms of adding value to our knowledge base and science and whatnot. Today, most of the colleges, universities in the world, including our own university, Geetham, is basically, if the student is able to publish a couple of papers, then that means the work is validated by their community, professional community, and therefore it's a valid piece of work that should be awarded a thesis, right? But I think then what is the purpose of dissertation? right? In the past, dissertation was the first document that came out, and publications and things like that would eventually come. But now that's not the case. I mean, in some sense, we are expecting students to publish first and then come to the defense. So in many ways, my own 400-page dissertation was also like that. It was a compendium of 15, 20 papers, and basically nobody would question after that because they were already published in conferences and some journals and things like that. But I think Professor Garish described it, the best possible manner. It is a personal diary, right? This is actually supposed to be a personal diary, and there's a lot of value to that diary. And of course, people get paranoid about actually exposing some of their inner thoughts about this research, and then maybe somebody else will steal. There is that always possibility. So one needs to be careful in terms of what goes into the thesis. But I think we tend to forget that during research, there can be failures and successes, right? And then failures, unfortunately, don't get reported in journals. Whereas thesis can be, we can report failures and, dissertations. And that has, I don't know, as scientists, we all realize that it is the failures that actually also add a lot of value to knowledge, which don't get published, unfortunately, in journals. But I think it's equally important to be archived somewhere. And then I think dissertation is probably the best place where we can actually archive those kinds of, not to repeat the same kind of mistake. And the other thing is basically for various reasons, the journal publications tend to be very concise, right? We end up basically presenting the key idea and then key results. And I'm a mathematician, so whatever I do is in front of the world to verify. But I do realize when it comes to experiments and, whether it's numerical or real experiments, science is all about repeatability, and do the journals give enough information for somebody to repeat the experiment? It's not always possible because of perhaps the length constraints or various reasons, right? And again, I would say dissertation is where you actually pretty much give all this particular data that one can actually repeat. And without repeatability, I don't think we should be talking about science anyway. For example, if I wrote a program and things like that, it obviously can never go into a journal paper, but it should go into a dissertation. And of course, keeping track of the theme that we have. Obviously, in the olden days, I don't think I have it in my thesis, but my BTech thesis had my program, Fortran program written. I don't think people ever look back at that particular Fortran program. It is obviously in a format that is useless. But today, we are talking about electronic theses and dissertations. We have ample opportunity to actually give a link and then basically some archive and things like that. So I'm not even, when I imagine today's dissertation, it should not necessarily be in a format that a typical university expects, but it actually can be in an HTML document. I know that we are far away from accepting something like that as a dissertation, but we should be able to accept knowledge of what went through an entire research process to be recorded in a manner that is convenient for everyone and accessible for everyone, and nothing better than basically digital way, right? Give a link to your program so that somebody can experiment and verify what you have done is the most valuable thing for us to have, right? So ideally, that's what I imagine today's dissertation to be, is basically completely transparent, except maybe the ideas that you still want to hold on to and then make it commercial value or patent or something like that. Beyond that, it should be available to everyone for verification, validation. And I think most important thing is failures, right? So that is my opinion about what we should do as far as dissertations and thesis.
Thank you very much. That's a great response. And now maybe I'd like to take you back to your graduate school days. You were in the US for your graduate training. And could you share your thoughts on your experiences with digital repository systems while you were a graduate student in the US? And maybe how that compares for the experience of a student in India today, what you've observed?
Yeah. So back when I was a student, obviously, Alta Vista was still there and Google was not there. So anyway, there were in nascent stages in some sense. But US had this tradition of basically archiving every dissertation there is in the world, at least in the country, I should say. University of Michigan used to maintain these archives. So everybody who completes, finishes their PhD, you have an option of actually, paying certain amount of money, and this would go into a format. It's called microfiche format, and some of us, who use these things may be familiar. Basically, they are a bunch of films, and University of Michigan basically could potentially mail those films to for anybody to see it. So the culture and the idea was there in the sense that dissertation should be accessible to everyone in the world. In practice, whether that happens or not is a different issue. But I think I am not aware of that culture in the past in India. But I think today we have these national repositories. We are trying our best in terms of keeping these things. And of course, obviously, we have the ability to do everything electronically, so it doesn't make any sense to put it in microfiche. We don't even have instruments to weave those things anymore. So we want to obviously do everything digitally. So in our university, we going back to the metaphor of a personal diary, we are trying to introduce processes where students basically do that, maintain a personal diary from starting to the end. It's provided some kind of LMS for research students where we can do all these things electronically managed, and at the end the dissertation should come out of it fairly straightforward, and of course eventually it will go in a certain format to these repositories and available for the rest of the world. And I want to talk about this availability for the rest of the world. One of the things that we keep doing, and even in our university we have Turnitin, Grammarly, and licenses, all kinds of licenses, and then we insist that students use them. But we tend to forget if it's not ever recorded, then there's no point, right? So therefore, this access is absolutely important. There are opinions where some people feel that, okay, if we record it, everybody will see it. But I think that is the whole point of actually doing something. And then if somebody else has done it, you don't want to be unethical and claim that it is your first work. So when it is archived in a fashion that is accessible in an electronic sense, accessible to everyone, we certainly can improve science rather than go back. So, I think India is on its right track, though in the past may not have been so diligent like University of Michigan archives and things like that, but I think we are on the right track.
Thank you very much. That's a great answer. And I'm glad you mentioned the microfiches, because we have Danny here with us, and later on we're going to hear from her. I'm sure she'll have stories to tell about the use of microfiches at Cambridge. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now invite Dr. Kole. So Dr. Kole, have a question for you. We've obviously heard from the scientist perspective the importance of ensuring that the content in the thesis is accessible for the community, and it'd be also great to hear from you from a national policy perspective. How important is it for the community to be able to access the data in the thesis? So that's my first question to you, Dr. Kole. Over to you.
Thanks, Savita, and thank you, AuthorCafé, for inviting me to share my thought. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm going to talk to you about something that, as Savita just now mentioned, because I have been engaged for quite some time on discussing the open science policies. It's just not in India, but globally. I would elaborate on why we should embrace this philosophy now, and also I will elaborate on how electronic thesis and dissertation can enable access to knowledge and data, which is obviously one of the central theme of open science policies. But before going there, let me take a little step back, and I will give you some theoretical understanding of why access to knowledge is important. Because Professor Ratnapakshi actually mentioned it, that we all know, but let's go back to the theory a bit as well. So I will start with the work of an eminent professor of economics, Professor Eleanor Ostrom. She was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. She won the Nobel Prize for her work on a theory known as natural resource commons. So what does this mean? We often observe that state countries fight with each other over the access to some common resources such as river water. Professor Ostrom's work established that such natural resources should be shared among the people rather than enclosing it or commodifying it. So her idea is extremely important and now, because to accomplish sustainable development, which is now talked about all the time, this idea is one of the very central to it. UN is reminding us regularly of the importance of attaining the 17 SDGs by 2030. So for a better and secure future of the planet, this is very much it is very much important that we achieve this target of SDGs. And if we really want to sustain, we have to have natural resources as common. Now, there is another type of commons that Professor Ostrom's actually observed. It is called knowledge commons. All science and scholarship constitutes this knowledge commons, and everybody should have access to the knowledge. There should not be any kinds of barrier to obtaining the knowledge. And how it helps? Because if people are able to access science and scholarship, then only it can grow faster. Making scientific knowledge available to everyone will increase scientific activity, developments of technology, innovation activities. So this is already a well-established phenomenon, and this is precisely the reason we are talking about open science, that we have to embrace open science philosophy. We have seen that in past few decades, science ecosystem has taken shape where journal paywall is blocking the content. Overemphasis on the intellectual property protection is locking knowledge propagation. A competitive structure is hampering the growth of scientific knowledge. In this backdrop, open science movement is promoting culture of knowledge sharing, collaboration, cooperation, transparency. So it's bringing back science to its core social value. And recognizing this, UNESCO has laid just now in 2021 November, their founding recommendation in open science, which all the member states already have approved of. And in India also, so coming back to Indian perspective, we had this draft science, technology, and innovation policy, which also have an entire chapter on open science. It's talking about open science framework that endorse more open, transparent, collaborative, inclusive scientific practices. And it is coupled with more accessible, verifiable scientific knowledge, which our previous speakers already told about why these are so important. And in this policy, there is a very clear statement on open access and open data from the publicly funded research, which are the two key elements of open science and should be freely available to everyone for use. But then obviously as a policy statement, well and good, we agree with it. But then the question now will arise that how we will achieve such a feat. How to implement seamless access to knowledge and data generated from research activities, especially from the publicly funded projects. So this is a place where ETDs can play an enabling role. From the policy perspective, not just as national level, just think of it. It can actually supplement institutional requirement as well. At this point, obviously, some question might arise among the listeners because they know about South Ganga. They know about that in the premier institution, at least there we have thesis repositories. PDF of the theses are being uploaded into the repositories and people can access. There might be certain barriers, but they can still access. Then why ETTs? Even if we ignore the pain that one has to go through accessing thesis due to unstructured metadata in this repository, there are many conditionalities that actually hampers accessibility. Let me give you an example first for that. Some theses are locked as it contains some knowledge that might be submitted for patent application. But do we need to actually lock the entire thesis for it? Obviously, no. We might devise some embargo policies on accessing content. We can actually open up the rest of the thesis, but certain content can be locked. So these are one of many issues that actually can be solved with ETDs. And ETD actually is, the format is also like, as it says, it's electronic. So it's not just static text like PDF. We can have text, we can have images. It can also support multimedias, because in biological sciences, for example, you might have certain videos. That's so important. So all this can be shared. So obviously it will increase accessibility. Not just that, I mean, it will increase transparency, reproducibility, reliability. So obviously at a policy level, also it is important. And as I already mentioned, that it can actually be governed based on the requirement of each and every institution. We don't really have to even devise a one model fit all approach. Agencies and institution can actually monitor who is accessing data, for what purpose, mechanism to recognize the original researchers, citation advantages for the researchers who has already wrote the thesis. So it's not just always paper, they can cite the thesis as well. So in my opinion, probably even if there might be some risk, as Professor Vijay mentioned, that my work, why should I actually make it open on those? But see the benefit, this can actually outweighs the risk. And I would really like to mention another factor, which probably is very important, that at present we need to change the culture. There is quite a low trust on the data, because we are hearing about image manipulation, data manipulation. So with these, where people are so forced, this publish or pedis culture, you have to publish in high impact factor, where because of those phenomenons, we are seeing reproducibility is a concern. So if we make the things more open, there will be definitely, it can solve the issue, maybe not completely, but to some extent. And that is why funders like Wellcome Trust, NIH are making their open data policies. And as we have seen actually previously as well, their policy support bring changes in the culture. See, as just Professor Ratna Bakshi mentioned the Human Genome Project, or mentioned about the Gene Bank, because of the right policy decision, these are now open. Those data you can openly access. And if you think that this culture can't be changed, then I would just take you back to a history. This is it's a story that I like so much, so I would like to share. So I'm taking you back to the time of Galileo, 1609. So he first time observed this rings of Saturn. I mean, imagine what kind of enormous discovery it was that time. But he didn't written down his finding or printed it or something. He just sent some cryptic letters to his fellow astronomers. But again, this was a time, it's 1609, and Gutenberg actually, the printing press was discovered something around 1400 something. So it's already been so long, but he didn't wrote. But then there is a massive shift in culture came with the introduction of the scholarly journal. The first academic journal des Cavans, was actually introduced in 1665, and soon after the Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society, again on 1665 itself. And the culture of sharing change, and I call it Open Science 1.0, but now we might need this Open Science 2.0, because advancements of the digital tool has gave us so much enormous opportunity. We don't have to use this journal at its present form. We can utilize all the potential that is there. So, and that's where I feel that electronic thesis can actually play a very much enabling role. We don't have to go to a journal. We can start from very beginning of the starting career of the researcher. And that will help in actually attaining the bigger vision of open science, not just the open data. Yeah, I will stop here, and obviously I will wait for some question answers.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely fascinating account over there. So we'll move on to Dr. Gautam, and I'm actually going to request Dr. Gautam to talk about ETD initiatives in existence in India. Dr. Gautam, can you share with us what is in existence, both at institutional and national levels, some ETD initiatives here in India? Over to you.
Thank you, Savita, and thank you, the team of AuthorCafé, for this wonderful program on ETD's webinar, and a very varied panelists. And thank you, Momita. She is now spearheading larger movement in India on open science. So ETDs, I was learning about it when our organization, ICR, has thought of putting up the Krishi Kosh. Earlier it was a Krishi Prabha, which was started in the Haryana Agricultural University. And then it went on to become the Krishi Kosh. It is larger than the Krishi Prabha. So that was about the ETD's journey, which I was learning. Simultaneously, the initiatives from the UGC is also there, that to have a PhD degree, the authors, the students, the researchers has to submit the PhD thesis in the thesis repository, openly available. And this Shodh Ganga is there. So I both follow each of these ETD's repositories. And also I look at the directory of open access repositories and see if there is any new thing is being added to that. So I see there is only a like static 100, and since long time I'm seeing it is 90 plus. Now it has reached to 110, something like that. Not many of the repositories are available or registered in this directory, but these are the two popular. And now we have the National Digital Library, which is also taking the data from these repositories and making it available. So now we have framework set. So then, but what is there, like when you take the two thesis repositories, which I see, Shodh Ganga or the Krishi Kosh, both are built on the DSpace software. See, I should also mention here, the software has, like the people who are working for the open source software, the free and open source, they are the people who made us to make our knowledge very openly available in without much any troubles. So these are the softwares which they are developed, and these are being utilized for all thesis repositories. ETDs of these two are built on the DSpace. But there is a one kind, like while the Shodh Ganga is view only option available on the screen, Krishi Prabha, the Shodh Ganga allows you to download the thesis. Both are government entities only, but there is a two policy decision. And the Shodh Ganga has a, the files have been split into introduction to the references. As Mamita was also saying that if you have any patent application pending, so you may not want to make one chapter available, probably the results. That can be later on after the embargo, you can lift it. The chapters are there. And the beauty of it is, like, it has also used the Creative Commons license, which says that you don't need to ask the author. Author has already given the rights to you to do what means they have adopted a policy, non-commercial, but share alike. So you can download, save it, and then work on it. Maybe you can do the mining or all those things if you have at the any of your softwares available on your desktop. But when I look at my own organization, Krishi Kosh, it has the policy taken due to what reasons we don't know. Still, this trust has to be built. So it is only view option. That is, full thesis is available. So, and there is no question of embargo, but means chapter wise. But there is embargo for 1 year. Like latest thesis, we cannot use it. So when I was doing my MSc thesis in Harvard, I had to confine only to my university library. But there is a Karnataka University Library, so we used to go there because I'm from my plant science, so some thesis consultation. But now the researchers has the at the tip of the click of the button, not tip. So he can access all the theses available, and many of the theses, like internationally, it is no embargoes are also available. In this sense, as soon as they submit, even like the April thesis is also available in right now. Like till April has not ended, but I saw there is a thesis available. So that's how some of the policies are helping out for making this the vast information, what is the personal diaries, what it is being talked here, making it available for online. So that, but I have one thing is, like even the previous speaker also said that PDFs, like why we should have only a PDF. So why can't be in any other format, like HTML was the Girish or the other person Vijay was saying. Now there is a call for talk about XML. So when you have that format in XML, that XML can take any format. It can take a PDF, it can take a normal HTML, it can take any other format. So Now those technologies are also available. But what we lack as a researcher, because now I'm not a researcher, but researchers lack the skills to learn and adopt. So you need some kind of support from the librarians or the IT support team to make the thesis in that fashion, so that that can be more open, like in the sense interoperability will be there, and then it can help in the data mining. So that will open up from the closed PDF. It will be a more openly available, so that that can help in the mining. And there are private EBSCO or ProQuest repositories. Submission is free, but maybe the institutes has to be having a sign up with them either by payment or I don't know what the thing, but availability is there, and people can also buy the thesis. I don't know why they are making it online available and also making it available for buying. So that is their business models. So that is also happening. And here, I was saying that XML format, there is a, America is one Latin American initiative supported by the UNESCO. They have developed a software which using that you can make it into XML format. And then some of the engineering students are already adopting LaTeX software that also can be made it into the PDF, and also that code can be also deposited, so that will help in the minings. So now we have different entities, thesis repositories. We can have a like a harvester which can harvest all these things. If suitable policies are adopted by these in repositories, that will help in more data mining. Because what previous speakers are saying, that you should also look at the timeline, like what the research has happened from like since one maybe on one mark of a year to till now, on which subjects, how it is being connected with others, and which are the areas which locations are working on what, which are the universities are working on what aspects. So all this can be done. I mean, we can analyze, and then that would be a very great data input for the policy formulation and for the like to have an improvement in the science to progress. So these ETDs should be made more open with the policy, and then technological involvement, and then capacity building. These three has to be more emphasized, so that we can have a more open thesis, which contributes to the more open science. As like only it cannot be a journal articles, but the whole thesis has to be read properly. So that needs to be made. And speaker which I was saying about the negative results, it is a results. It may be positive or negative for the people, but what we have done, what was the methodology, what are the results? So that is the documentation which we have to do for the future people to improve upon, or to work further, or to collaborate. So that when you, I've been told when I was learning about the open science movement, the first Rourkela, NITR, is the institute which has taken a decision that is the first mandate of open access, and all the dissertations of the engineering students there were put up in online for like public to consult and read or download whatever they want. But after some time, there is again they say that there was a stoppage, like they don't want to make it more open. So some changes have come. Probably that is because the IP more emphasis by the research management, research what is the ranking frameworks, or all whatever has come up. So that made the curtail the openness. So when that has to be like, as a community has to discuss, if the institution policy is not supporting, as a researcher, how he can make it his thesis available, because the authors are the owners of it, so they should have also their rights to make it open. So they can take a call if they are not suitable, the repositories to deposit their documents into that PhD thesis. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. And I think Momita also referred to institutional policies, and it's a very interesting point that individual authors can take the responsibility, work with their institutions, but also perhaps find other solutions. And you also referred to the role of the librarian. So on that note, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Danny Kingsley, representing the librarian community. Dr. Kingsley, very warm welcome to you here. You've previously worked at Australian National University, at Cambridge University, and now work at Flinders at Australia. Could you share a brief history of how ETDs came to be used at these institutions? And what was the motivation behind bringing in this mode of digital archiving? And maybe what impact these interventions have had on scholarly communications? There's quite a lot in there, but over to you, Danny.
Yeah, there is. And thank you for this invitation. And thank you for those of you who are listening along today. I appreciate it. So I thought it might be helpful for me to talk about sort of the technology first, because we have been speaking about technology and policy. They are really go hand in hand when we're talking about making theses available electronically. So in Australia, in about 1998, so a very long time ago, 7 universities got together to create some software that would allow theses in Australia to be made available online. And in the year 2000, that was shared amongst all of the universities here. And so it was voluntary, but what it was a package of software that it was able to be used at an individual level, individual institutional level, for people to be able to put theses in through the library. And then they were collected together, and there was one portal online called the Australasian Digital Thesis Portal, ADT. And so that worked really well it was one of the world's first attempts to collect together electronic theses. Then in about 2006, the government in Australia invested a lot of money in infrastructure for research, including infrastructure for repositories. So then we were in a situation where we started having repositories at each university that was for the research output of the university. So that meant that we had a place individually where we were able to put our theses that was with the rest of our research output. So by 2011, the original ADT software was decommissioned because all of that research and those theses were now sitting individually in the institutional repositories and collected together in something called Trove, which is run by the National Library of Australia. So you can access all of the theses that are available in Australia through Trove. So in 2009 or so, we started having discussions at Australian National University about requiring people to give us a digital version of their thesis. So what had been the case up till then was that people were able to provide a digital version of their thesis, but we didn't really have anywhere to put it. And then also we had digital versions of the theses where somebody had requested a digital version. And so they were sitting in drawers, either on microfilm or on CDs. We didn't even have a list of what they were. I literally had to sit with my colleague and I called out the name of the author and the name of the thesis, and she typed them up. That was how we generated our first list of the theses we even had electronically. So we had a situation where we had students who started with a digital work on their computer. They created an analog version, and here's one I prepared earlier. Here's my PhD thesis. So this is an analog version of the thesis that then the library was then scanning to reproduce an inferior digital version of the work that we were then making available. It was ridiculous. So we said, let's change the policy. So we're asking the students to provide a digital version as well as the hardbound version. And because our repository at the time was still being developed, we actually asked them to put it on a CD stuck in the back of the thesis, which then became a second object we had to catalogue in the library. So it was very, in retrospect, very clunky. And there was a lot of controversy about we can't force people to make their theses open access and blah, 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 blah. So that wasn't what the policy was. It was just requesting for a digital version of the work. That went on at ANU, Australian National University, and then I moved to Cambridge. And so in 2015, there were about 700 theses available in the repository and openly accessible. There, again, was a large number of theses that had been digitised at some stage that were not anywhere except on a server. And so we started pulling those available theses into the repository, but keeping them shut down. So they were available, you could find them and then you could request them. So that made them more findable. So that meant that they were being Googled because the repository is properly indexed. Whereas while they was findable in the library catalogue, and you could either come into the library and have a look at the thesis or request it be digitised and sent to you, the library catalogue isn't indexed the way the repository is. So if you're just doing a Google search, you won't find something that's in a library catalogue, but you will find something that's in a repository. So if we think about fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, reproducible, the findable part is increased if you've got work in something that is being indexed. So that was an improvement. But then we went through again, it was about 2017, I think it was, at Cambridge, that policy of asking people to give us a digital version of their thesis. And in that instance, the policy was really incendiary at the time, because in the initial version of it was expecting people to make their thesis open access within a period of time. And that hadn't been worked through with our community. So there was a lot of work that had to be done with the community about what was acceptable, what were the barriers to making something openly accessible. Could it be made openly accessible after a period of time, or was there a other reason why it needed to be shut down? And so there was a lot of conversation about what was held in the repository and how you manage it. And we've already talked a little bit about this in some of the other talks so far. But I think we do need to think about that fair question, the findable, the accessible, which is making it available online. We've talked a bit about that. The interoperable question comes back to the question about the PDF, and does that make the work interoperable? And then the reusable part of that is, are we also making the data that sits behind the theses available? And in some cases, the answer to that is yes, in others, no. So that's been the sort of my involvement over time in getting theses into an electronic state and getting them online. But then also what sits behind that is the question about what has that done for scholarly communication? And I think that the thing that has been really valuable in this whole process is the ability for us to actually open the conversations with the academic community. That's where things have really, theses are a fantastic key to that conversation. There's a lot of, and I know I have some academics who are on the panel with me, and there are probably many academics listening, so I apologise if you find this offensive. I don't mean it to be offensive, but many academics go through the process of learning to become an academic, and then that is the way that it is done for them. And so they don't necessarily see that there might be value in a conversation to be had with a librarian about what has changed in this whole scholarly communication world since the time that they went through their training process. And so when you have somebody supervising a student who then has some requirements, for example, to make their thesis open access, or to address questions like third-party copyright held in my thesis, how do I manage that? Then suddenly, or a data management plan, I need to create a data management plan. Now, the supervisor may or may not know about these things. So that's an opportunity for a conversation to talk about those issues and how the university would like to approach those questions. And then it means that this is a gentle way to teach our academic community about some of the things that have changed and are changing as we move forward. So that's really how the electronic, I see, the electronic theses has really sort of moved scholarly communication forward.
Thank you so much, Danny. And I also take the point that you need an institutional policy and a process, a mechanism for all the people all the stakeholders who are involved to be able to work together towards a common goal. And here I was wondering if you can share some insights about sensitive material. I know Momita also spoke about that there might be parts of the thesis which need to be hidden, parts that can be openly accessible. I'm sure you've seen examples of that. So from a technology perspective, is there a way of dealing with that, and a process perspective? Love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. And sensitive material can take many forms. So it might be something as simple as third-party copyright, that you don't have permission to, if you've got a reproduction of an artwork in a thesis, you don't have permission to make that openly accessible. So it might be as simple as that. Or it could be because it contains commercially sensitive material, because you might have a thesis that is sponsored by a commercial company, and so there is some commercial in confidence information in the thesis. There might be some sensitive material because it's culturally sensitive. So certainly within our Indigenous communities here in Australia, there is enormous amounts of material that is culturally sensitive, that is that they may have given permission for the person to study, but not permission for them to make it available publicly, things like secret women's business or secret men's business, or the location of the burial grounds of a certain person, for example. There's also ecologically sensitive material. So you might be writing a thesis about a particularly rare plant, and you don't want to identify where that plant is, because it will go from being rare to being extinct, because people will then go and track it down and it becomes commercially valuable. So there's all sorts of reasons why you might want to make something, keep something from the openly accessible part of your thesis. So depending on which one of those it is how you might want to address that. So something like third-party copyright, this is why the policy needs to be in place at the beginning of the research process, not right at the end, because if it's at the end and you don't have permission, it's too late. But you do have an opportunity to address questions like third-party copyright at the beginning. About it's a learning process. A PhD is supposed to teach you how to become a researcher. If your research involves third-party copyright, then you should, as part of that process, understand what that means and having to be able to try to get hold of permission and so on. You can always redact those images, and I've done that for people in their theses, or as has already previously been suggested, this kind of sensitive material can sit in an addendum. So you could make the body of the thesis openly available, but the addendum is shut down for research purposes. So that's one sort of way of addressing those sorts of questions. A different kind of sensitivity could be if the work is going to be made available for patent, or their intention is to patent the work. Now, depending on the law in the country, and it's different in different countries, it's certainly different in Australia to in the UK. In Australia, there is more leeway on patents, where you do have a period of time where if the work's been in the public domain, you do have a sort of grace period within which you can apply for the patent. But in the UK, if any information about that patent is in the public domain, the patent is null and void immediately. So we had a process in, and I can share the link that describes all these things that is online on the Cambridge website. We had a process for people depositing their thesis, where they had to answer a whole series of questions along these lines. Does your thesis contain third-party copyright? Do you have permission for it, etc., etc.? Are you intending to publish the work? So on. And one of the questions is any part of this work intended to be patented? Now, our workflow process there was different for those theses than any other, because those theses could not be put into the repository and locked down. So what normally would happen is, if there was some restriction for some reason on the work, we'd put it in the repository, the metadata would be made available, including the abstract, but the thesis itself is shut down until whatever time it is able to be made available. We couldn't do that with the patents, because the repository metadata is available under CC0 license and is indexed in things like Scopus, which means that inadvertently we could have put a thesis in, locked it down, and thought everything was fine as far as the patent went. But because the metadata is then being indexed and put into Scopus, that invalidates the patent. So we had to create a separate workflow for those particularly sensitive works. So you can see it gets very complex very quickly. And so it does require some really deep thinking across all of the potential scenarios.
Thank you so much. That's really insightful. And I'm actually going to turn the question back to Momita, back to maybe a policy perspective again, a slightly provocative question. Are there any matrices which are relevant for ETDs? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether we should again go in trap of any matrices, because we already have seen the problem, because people are so hung up with journal impact factor or H indices. So, but then again, I mean, number helps. So I would not disagree on that as well. When even when there is some decision has to be made, then going through the whole thesis and everything might just get a bit too cumbersome. So, I mean, in some ways, well, I would not say that matrices directly assigned to anything, but then give importance that if a thesis is made available publicly, especially honestly, most of the work we don't go for patent, and in science. There are some fields where some human subject involvement is there. Otherwise, in general, the kind of work that we do in lab, it does not require much a thought on the process that it is sensitive. Mostly it's not. Then the whole thing can be available in electronic form. All the data should also be available, because I already mentioned it point, taking the theory from the economics, which is already well established, that if we make it open, if it is available, it can actually grow. So in that sense, I would say that maybe from the policy perspective, certain advantages can be advantages. I mean, maybe in while evaluating, there can be some points given that if it is openly available, that is well and good. And if it is not, then it has to be a clear statement why it is not. So I would not go directly in some numbers, but such kind of policy decision can be taken, that I can feel.
Thank you so much. Now, I think I'll just open up to some broader questions, which I'd request all our panelists to share their thoughts on. So we've heard. I mean, there's clearly, from a researcher perspective, there are very clear benefits to having the content in thesis openly available, and from a policy perspective, that's important as well. There are very important, crucial institutional mechanisms that need to be in place to ensure that ETDs are used effectively within the organization. So the question I have to all of our panelists, and maybe we'll take a couple of views here, what could be done? What are the steps that could be done to make the use of ETDs more widely accepted at institutions? And maybe Professor Vijay, I just request you to share your thoughts. As an academic, as a researcher, what might you think are some of the barriers to the use of ETDs at institutions which maybe can be addressed? Dr. Vijay, over to you.
I mean, if you specifically ask me about barriers, I should say there should not be any barriers. As a policy, we should publish everything electronically. Earlier, I made a point that the formatting of the thesis itself, I think, needs to move on into more, broader way of putting things together. Mr. Sridhar suggested the XML format, for example. I don't know really what that is, but I think it's something to do with web friendly, I suppose, right? Where we have a bunch of links and things like that. And then I think as a university, as a academic community, we should accept those kinds of format rather than stick to our old, introduction should be so many pages, literature survey should be, and things like that, right? And that will certainly make it very useful, right? And of course, there's always the issue. I mean, though I'm a proponent of open science, it's not going to happen. Eventually people will be worried about commercial value or some of the value that they want to protect certain things. So we still give that choice to the researcher for opening up. But especially when we start talking about PDFs and things like that, the page limit may not be there, but people start thinking about those aspects and things like that. So we should move away from those kinds of things and make it truly electronic in a broader format. And see how many times all of us may have seen this happening. The idea that we have worked on, and suddenly we discover, did this happen to me as a kid itself? Basically, Euler discovered something that I found out 200 years ago. And then, of course, it's not publishable, but at least it's a story to be told that how I reached the same result, and then that is beneficial for many things. I mean, people think that if you reach the same result, it's not publishable in journal, perhaps because this is not new. But I think the way we reached is absolutely important. So all these things, I think, in going back to Professor Girish's terminology, it should be truly a personal diary, and then if it is a diary, then the formatting should be in that fashion where it cannot be the same standard format of introduction, literature survey, followed by main results and conclusion and things like that. It should be left slightly free. But of course, I suppose we as academicians should think, what could be the generic format that is, is inclusive of many possibilities. Theoreticians may have one kind of format, and then experimentalists may prefer something else. We need to take a broader look and think about these things. And I think it's high time that we actually use the technology. Earlier there was a talk about PDF, but I think PDF can only do so much. PDF is just digitalization of whatever we are doing old, before. That microfiche to PDF is not the best thing to do. We have to move on and do much better than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Girish, I was wondering if you'd like to talk about this, maybe also from a cultural aspect of, how can scholars and their supervisors embrace these kinds of developments?
Yeah, so there are many threads, if I may use the word, which have been introduced by the panelists, and I'll try and touch upon some of them. I don't think, at least in India, there is any doubt in anybody's mind that knowledge in terms of research work should be shared freely. The only thing I see in my community is time delay switches. Delay the release of the data by 6 months, by a year. That's the maximum thing we have dealt with. If there are faculty who are trying to commercialize some aspect of their work, then they don't put that work out in the open till things are commercialized. And students also usually agree with this philosophy because they are part of the patent, for example, which is being discussed. Now, let's see. Let me see if I can pick up a few things. So we have transited. I think Danny may have indirectly or directly commented on this. I think she showed her thesis and said that probably her thesis and theses of that generation were just scanned into PDFs, but these PDFs were not really searchable, right? Now we have PDFs which are searchable, and we have again, this is something different panelists have said. We have different technologies, XML, HTML formats, which allow us to link, which allow us to see videos and basically connect more freely to other interconnected pieces of data. So effectively, what we really need is a sort of a universal, I know I'm being very optimistic and very ambitious over here, a universal statement from pretty much, let's say, a librarian, and that would be really very, very useful, who would say that this is the kind of format you need to be in for the next 20 years or for the next 10 years, 20 years being too far ahead to think. And let that universal format of producing material be sent to everybody who's involved in the academic business. And it seems fairly straightforward to me that a program like Microsoft Word, which I'm sure 80% of the community probably uses, maybe I'm wrong, I know 95% of the biological community uses Microsoft Word, can be very easily converted to a format which is a so-called universal format. And this universal format will be released. Things which are, of course, things are behind paywalls, but we ignore all of this. We now have a format which is easily convertible and which can be utilized by all. And the moment that format is there, it becomes searchable. You can index it. I don't think computational power at the moment is a rate limiting step in linking up. And I know that these universal formats are very doable because, again, I am going to use my experience in the biological sciences. We have I'll take a very specific technical example, which may not reach out to all the people over here. Sequencing data, for example. When we are dealing with sequencing data, there is a clear set of rules we have to follow on how to collect the data, how to analyze the data, and how to present the data. There is not too much flexibility. And we have to follow these guidelines. And these guidelines are very clearly written down in actually a research paper, which is available. So having a certain set of guidelines is doable. The question is who will bell the cat? And that is a question I'll leave to the panelists.
Thank you very much. And I'll probably take the question to Momita. What do you think might be helpful for ensuring that ETDs are more widely accepted at institutions?
I would answer it in a different way, in such that it's more about if we educate the people, I mean the involved, the stakeholders, even the students and the professors, because so far we are stuck with maybe Microsoft Word because that's the most easy format. But then if there are formats available, which might even get a bit difficult to start with, but later when we see how much advantage it brings, and not only just to work as a as a researcher while working on the format or document, if we can show everyone the bigger picture of it. Because see, again, when people are in academia, when we are working in the academic setup, there is a mindset that we are working for a greater good. People do peer review. There is no payment. People are being editor of journals. There is no monetary incentive for it. Its incentive is to take the science forward. So I feel that if these things can be circulated properly, people get in more engaging conversation, then people slowly and automatically will move to that formats. There might be some training needed, but then the institution can come forward to bring. And also, I don't see that the policy level decisions also should be the same for everyone. There can be a broader guideline from the national funding agencies like DST, DBT, or so. Even in our fifth draft or policy, STI policy draft also, after a lot of deliberation and discussion, the broader statement was the publicly funded research should be made available to the public. But definitely, if it is intellectual property, something is there, it can be under some lock and key. But an institution level policy can change. Institution can make their own policy. Some institutions can have very much applied research where a lot of things goes into next TRL level. So they can make a different policies for their thesis. So that's what I would say, that let's take it in the way, the spirit that it has to be done. Let's make everyone teach them on the policy level decision, make it on the institution level, how and what their student could do. So that would be my submission to it.
Thank you so much. And I'm also hearing that, again, the need for institutional policy. So maybe in terms of the awareness, it might also be helpful for institutions to have a platform where they can share best practice on their experiences and how they have implemented, and maybe what policies they have found helpful. So this kind of community sharing of best practice might also be helpful. Yeah, thank you. Sridhar, what would you say? What do you think might be enabling for ensuring wider uptake of ETDs in India? You've obviously seen it from your own.
Yes. Like we need to work, I was saying that the capacity building on two aspects. One is technological, and then law, policy level. So policy has to be taken in decision at the institutional level, but the technology, the new things which are coming up, somebody has to coach us, train us. Probably the AuthorCafé can take an initiative and like training us in how to use the new technologies, which will help us to make our thesis document very interoperable format. Because we don't want to, when we are opening up, we don't want to just allow for only few, when let's like some aspect of it. When we open, it should be more open. So in that like fashion, these technologies which are coming up, what I was saying of the XML technology, which can take any shape and can also connect with other XML documents, there will be a linkages can be established, and then you can link up the documents, or you can link up the many things, and you can jump from one to there, and then more data mining, anything can be possible. So the more of technology usage has to be accelerated, and then there should be one either from the institutional level or the third party like AuthorCafé or any other person should come into the picture, because we need this capacity building. I am myself learned, but it took a lot of time in learning, and if I want to teach, I don't have time. So there should be some mechanism for the capacity building as a part of curriculum, where the researchers, they themselves can make their thesis. Where most of the researchers are doing that themselves because of the availability of all those gadgets with us. Like earlier, we have to go to computer centers to make it, but now we're doing it. And then universal format was the talking about. So I think many of the like VTU, I can say from Karnataka, Technology University, Vishwesvaraya Technology University, they have developed their own LaTeX-based thesis format. All the researchers has to format it using that format only. But maybe there will be some classes to them to how to use it. but everything will be of the same, no change, because it's all set. So like that, any format can be adopted, but the contents or the flows or the links or the what can be decided. Then so that will help in a universality, the standardized formats for more interactions or interoperability.
Thank you very much. And I see that you put a link in the chat box to the XML format, so that's very helpful. And I think, Danny, you've also shared some content in the chat box, so our audience members can take a look at those resources as well. Danny, let's bring the question back to you about what can be done to ensure better uptake of ETD initiatives. Based on your experience, what would your thoughts on that be?
Well, I gave a presentation about the sort of digital future at Cambridge to a particular group of stakeholders, and we were talking about the two different types of digital libraries. So we've got the digitisation of the material that is held, the unique material that's held in the university. So a lot of old manuscripts and scripts and so on that have been digitised, which was my colleague was presenting, and I was presenting the digital output of the research that's done at the university. So that includes our theses. And so we had made Stephen Hawking's thesis available a year before. So obviously it broke the internet. That was obviously our most downloaded thesis, but that's a bit of an outlier. So we took the next most downloaded thesis. And so these are theses that are openly accessible. So it's not just that they're electronic. It's not just that they're findable in a repository. They are readable. You can download them and read them. And that had been downloaded, I think, probably about 450,000 times. So a lot. Open access theses are the most used material in libraries. And so I said, I know what we can do. Why don't we take a photograph of where it's sitting on the shelf? Because you can still go into the library and request it off the shelf. And what happens then is if somebody requests a thesis off the shelf, there's a little sticker in the front of the book, and people who've looked at it sign it. So you can sort of see how many times it's been requested. I said, can you take a photo of the shelf, take the thesis off the shelf and take a photograph so we can compare how often it was looked at when it was only available in the hard copy format? And the answer was it had never been taken off the shelf. So in the 10 years that it had been existing before we made it available online, no one had looked at it. And once we made it online, available open access, it had been downloaded 450,000 times. And I think that is the end of the conversation, because they all just said, stop, and all were just staring at that one slide. And you could see they were all trying to understand what that really meant. And what it meant was, it is ludicrous not to do this. So that's my anecdote that I think answers that question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So that brings us to the final question I have for our panelists, but also I'd like to remind all our participants, please put in your questions and questions into the Q&A box, and any comments into the chat box. I know our panelists are also writing in. So the final question really is, what does the future of ETDs look like? And maybe Danny, I'll just start with you for this round, and I'd actually like to ask you, what do you think the future of ETDs is for young people, for the students who are actually going through this entire new way of working?
I think it's easier for them now because there is now this expectation of work being made available. So certainly in Australia, there are many universities that don't accept hard copy theses anymore. The thesis is only in electronic form. And there are many universities that require it to be made available, openly accessible. It may be given a short embargo, but there is the expectation it's made openly accessible. So they're starting the whole process with that expectation. So I think in that conversation is in the past now. And I think that we really need to be talking for the future about some of the things that have come up today, that the one size fits all, the old fashioned style of thesis that was written for a particular purpose, to train the person to become a scholar is not fit for purpose, because we know that the vast majority of people who do PhDs do not become scholars. So we need to think about what is the most effective way of sharing the research that is being done. And in some cases, it may be to share the underlying code. It may be to talk just to the data. It may be to share a mathematical model that is in 3 dimensions on screen. whatever is appropriate for the area of research, so that we are providing our PhD scholars with the best way for them to communicate their research and their broadest skill set, and not restrict them to something that is, even if you do become an academic scholar, you never write another thesis. So it's sort of, it's rather an aberration. So that's where I'm hoping things are going to go, that we are really going to start to see a very big diversity of what a PhD looks like.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to take the question to Professor Vijay. What do you think the future of ETDs in India is likely to look like?
Yeah, I think I've already made a point in that the ETD has to move away from the standard format that we've been following. We are talking about young generation that uses videos for their resumes and so on. So therefore, I would imagine it will look very different. And in fact, the presentations that students do in front of the defense panel could actually be valid dissertations, and then the PDF copies are appendices and whatnot. Like I said, it has to be friendly in this technology-driven world. I think we need to archive all these aspects of the research work in a format that is accessible to every part of the world, every person in the world. And of course, beyond the fact that we want to hide few things for commercial purposes, I think this will add a lot of value in terms of progressive science. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think on that note, we'll actually start taking questions from the audience. We have a couple of questions in the chat box. So I'll just read out the first question, which I know Dr. Girish has answered, but maybe it'd be good to have some views. Electronic theses and dissertations work are definitely required. I wish electronic theses and dissertations can be openly reviewed by anybody who reads it and leave a comment, maybe a question or any doubt, which should be available to the author and supervisor in real time. Oh, that's a daunting prospect. But Dr. Girish, would you like to comment on that? I know you've responded to the question.
Yes, so I have, when PLOS One first came out many years ago, I think it must be a couple of decades now, I was fairly excited to see that the concept, and this is the concept the questioner has basically underlined, of somebody putting up a paper and being allowing anybody to comment in the remarks section and to make suggestions, point out mistakes, so that a second copy of the paper would then be put in with all the corrections, and there would be a free flow of communication between the author and the individual who wanted to comment on it. But when we actually saw the first year of PLOS One papers, there was barely any communication. Even now, if you go back, nobody wrote comments. So this is something to do with humans as a whole, and as the way our social lives are, the way we have opinions, but we don't want to voice them. And I have no idea why, because I had plenty of opinions, but I never voiced them in any of those papers. So the answer to the question posed over here is that, at least in my mind, unless you are targeted and you are told it's your job to review this paper, you will not really review the paper. Now, Twitter is a whole new ballgame, and I see a lot of comments on papers on Twitter, but I think a huge chunk of them are just pat on the backs. Like, hey, you got a paper, I'm so happy. That's about it. So it's not actually scholarly in any sense of the word, but I'd like to hear what the other panelists think about this.
Yeah. Are there any other comments from the panelists in response to this question?
Yes, so I want to let us be honest about some of the things that happen, right? There are fantastic institutes in the country as well as the world, and then there are institutes that produce not so high quality PhDs, right? And given this particular fact, in some sense, closed door thesis defense is actually, will be encouraged, will continue to be encouraged. So when you open it up for rest of the world to comment on your research, what could happen is very few people want to do a PhD. But I think we should step back and say, is it absolutely essential for something fantastic to come out of a thesis? Well, I mean, PhD, in my opinion, is actually a training ground, right? Where students get a chance to think about a problem that you otherwise don't get to do it in a classwork or even a workplace and things like that. Now we stop appreciating that aspect of learning. I mean, let us accept that basically PhDs are still a training ground for academicians more than, there are aspects where basically they produce fantastic work and they can go to industry and things like that. But still, we need a lot of academicians to actually train the next generation of students and things like that. If we keep that in mind, I think we should ease our goal in terms of basically making sure that this result is absolutely new and therefore cannot be published. It should be more looked at in terms of the learning aspect that this particular student is doing. And therefore, when you look at it that way, the dissertation is basically what has this person learned during this experience of PhD while working on a new problem. Perhaps failure is one of the outcomes, but the learning is still should be appreciated. So therefore, opening up that particular learning is not of a problem for anybody. But typically, when you put something that's mediocre result, people are worried that it's not valid. But if it is a matter of saying that, okay, I learned something new, but this is something not new to the world, that's still okay. So I think we should pay attention to that aspect of PhD and not just the brand new results.
Thank you very much for your views. So, Sridhar, I know we have a question for you, which I know you've responded to, but maybe we can just pick it up. Please, could you provide more information regarding submission of online thesis and selection thesis for references? Which sites should we use? So, if you could just talk about
we should be believing in this model called the lots. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. And in one of the questions, they were saying that in 1990 they couldn't get their papers, something. And yesterday I was visiting a thesis site; it was not available. So if you have only one site or you don't have a mirror sites, you will be losing the access at that time. Maybe later you may be doing it. So if you have more copies, you can have access from any of those which is available. And 3 links I have shared. One is the Zenado, which is open, and then Thesis Commons, or it is for the thesis, and then Internet Archive. You can archive your thesis into that, so that will be preserved forever. And the question about the commenting all these things, yes, there are. This Thesis Commons is using a Plaudit, one add-on things for that. Using that, you can say about the research, or you can comment upon. And there is also one product name called Hypothesis, I think. Using that, you can select a portion of a text and then you can comment on that. So that will help in learning more. Like my thesis was completed sometime back in 2004, but when I want to revisit and I want to share with the people, so they may go and look at it if I ask, or if it is they feel comfortable. So they can go and say that this is the one you have done, or maybe future research can be taken forward on this way. So that comments can be done. So that will help in the improvement. And the publication is not the end. So it always needs to be a part of the discourse. Either you agree, disagree, or you make it more improved, or you connect with other things. So it's like we are growing. Like the research is also growing, and it's a more conversation kind of thing, not like doing a one experiment and then just publishing and then no, it is not the end. So we are all not doing that one. We are going more into that, revisiting what we have done previously. So all these things are being now done, and these ETDs, the T and Ds, if it is added with E, will help in more conversation, more refinement, more reproducibility, and more access. And we also get more compliments if it is available and that people read your work, and then you also feel happy that work has been cited or quoted or talked about it.
Thank you very much. Danny, I was wondering if you were raising your hand to make a point.
Yes, I was just in relation to the question about being able to comment and so on, there's a technological barrier to that, regardless of whether people wanted to do it or not. Institutional repositories are not social media platforms. They were developed well before social media existed. So they're kind of repository 1.0, and we sort of need repository 2.0. I have put something in the Q&A about this, that ResearchGate and academia.edu were developed post social media and do have that opportunity for people to comment and so on, except that they are both commercial organisations. And so by all means use them, but use them on the understanding that they are commercial, that you are giving your material to them, that it's not necessarily vetted, that it can be in contravention of copyright, etc., etc. So the difficulty for institutions is that, as somebody who's now worked in multiple universities, having to breathe life back into the repository because it's been left to, just rot in the corner, to actually develop a new repository that is able to do that and then migrate all the material across is an enormous undertaking that's very expensive, and it would be probably quite difficult to convince the institution to invest that kind of money in something like that. So there is actually a technological barrier to that, and it is a failing. I think we are in a position, if we're now talking about all these different types of what a PhD might look like into the future, current repositories can't cope with that. So we really need to be thinking, what is it that we need to hold this stuff? And it's probably not at the institutional level. Why are we reproducing things over and over and over again? We should be thinking about perhaps creating some sort of, well, the European Science Cloud is still a fantasy, but something like that for us to put this material into, that then we'd think about what would we like that to be able to do. And that's when that ability to comment might come into it.
Thank you very much. That's really valuable. I think we have a question in the box. Is there some criteria to grade ETDs to ease selection by researcher for their research work? I was wondering if one of our panelists would like to comment on that. I don't know if this relates to the issue of metrics that we discussed. Is it about the quality of the ETDs? But I don't know. Are there any of our panelists who would?
Yeah, I will come here.
Yeah.
I see the Shodhbanga has a alt metric plugin added to that, but I am not seeing much of the data into that, but probably in future it may be there. So that is one of the criteria other than the impact factors, what Momita was saying. So it is alternate metrics, which like it will take into consideration what are like the download citations or the social media post or any other things. So that is one of the criteria can be taken, but it is up to the policy. Like the APA course doesn't talk about the quality. It only says that it should be published. And if it is published as a book also, they consider it. So as the metrics, the new metrics has to come, and then should also have some incentives for the people to make the thesis more open. So that may help in more grading or rest from differentiating from the other rest. Not on the quality aspect, I'm saying about the like more open assessments.
Thank you very much for that. We have another question, and I think Sridhar, I just request you to talk about that.
But before Savita, I would just have to, I was just, because listening to this just made me again a step back to reflect on it, that again, if we start having those matrices associated with, even for a thesis, it's okay, fine, good idea, we can have it. But then if we talk that a thesis will be great, even in the back of mind also, by if we get influenced by those, that thing, will that really be a good idea? Because it has already happened that at least maybe in India still it's better, but for example, take the case of China, they were so hung up with matrices. So for example, even some of the Nordic countries, so their promotion, even research was assessed based on where you are publishing, and these kind of matrices. They even had cash, some kind of incentive to publish in Nature also. But that backfired, because just now China released a policy statements that they are going to go away from this metrics base to make a more a qualitative assessment of research. It will be a balanced approach. Local context specific research will get a lot of importance to it, even local language. So I just wanted to kind of make a caution to this, that knowing the data of download, citation is very good idea. We can know all this, but let's be cautious on the front to take decision based on that. So that would be my submission here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Girish, I think maybe you wanted to say something. I think you'll have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I have to remember basically what exactly I wanted to talk about. So if I just wanted to make a point, if you think in terms of the EMBO journals as an example, they are now putting out reviews of those journals right alongside the paper itself. So the reviewers' comments are now open access, if I may use the word. So it will actually be quite useful to have reviewer comments on thesis also put alongside with the thesis, which is something at least in India has not done at all. And the second point I wanted to make is it's to evaluate a thesis is a very tricky business, because to evaluate a thesis, the evaluator has to be a specialist in that area, and increasingly with specialization, that is not something easy to do. So rating a thesis, which is I think the point Momita was also making, is a tricky business. But I do think as a policy, putting in reviews in a thesis and making them open access is a very good idea and should be followed.
I will just quickly make another comment here. So, for example, there was a discussion in DST level as well that what about when a review of a project proposal happen? Are the reviewer willing to put the comments and open? And there is a hesitancy. So obviously, as a policy level, is probably a very good idea. Then again, as a community, we have to come forward that we take the action, we take it upon us on that we are willing to make it open, or like make our review open, be it on thesis or be it on any other format here. So I would just wanted to make this in that there are some certain hesitancy. So yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much. I think that's been really comprehensive. We have another question. Maybe this is a question for Sridhar. Could electronic theses and dissertations be integrated within archive services? The latter are anyway open access.
Yeah, definitely. It can be, as like the institutes or universities, some of the institutes have put up a policy that who owns the thesis. Some says it is a joint authorship of the copyright, joint ownership of the copyright by the student and the supervisor. Some says only the author itself, and some says no, it is you cannot do it any copyright business kind of thing, maybe in US kind of thing, when it is with the public funded. But if there is a contract between the written contract, so who owns the ownership is clearly defined in that. But if nothing is there and you are the creator, you are the author of the thesis, you are the creator, so you are the author and you owns the copyright. If it is registered or not registered, you can deposit anywhere, because if the institution has a policy, you can have a copy of it there and also have a copy in somewhere else also as well. And this can also be it gets connected to the e-resources like the other databases which can harvest and also make it available.
Thank you, Sridhar. And since you mentioned copyrights, actually there is a question in the questions box about copyrights being the enabler and the barrier. And that if patented information is involved, 1-year embargo would be sufficient. Institutional IPR policy of some universities owns copyrights of scholarly output from their professors. And in cases where there is no written institutional policies on copyrights assignments to the university, I'm afraid the question is truncated, but maybe Sridhar, you could just respond.
Yeah, I think they were asking about the copyright issues of the thesis and the institutional policies as well. But generally, I was learning and reading the policies. They say whosoever creates in the scientific field, they are not. They may have a copyrights on the books or the other materials which have been developed using the resources of the university or the institute. But when it comes to the scientific literature, they have removed it from their policy and then kept aside. And there is a central government conduct rules also says that scientific literature is the employee, he himself owns it. So basically, it is they have left it to individuals. But somewhere there is a tag added to that. I was saying about the supervisor is also added to the ownership. If there is no written agreement and they have free can take it forward, and the copyrights are it will give the ownership. It doesn't mean that you cannot share it. See, if I own a copyright, it doesn't mean that it cannot be shared. I can license it. I can license it on the terms. If the Creative Commons, you can take a help of the Creative Commons, and Shodh Ganga is one of the example. They say that they encourage the authors to submit in the Creative Commons license share alike policy level. And the same deposits are also in the Shodh Ganga is also available on the similar lines. So that policy they have taken up. Similarly, any institution, if they have the policy of the copyright on these aspects, they can tweak towards this. But definitely copyrights are not going to end in that, because when you are the owner, so you have the rights. All the rights are with you, and you can do whatever you want.
Thank you very much, Sridhar. And I think it's a discussion in full flow right now, but I think I'll bring our webinar to a close today. So a huge thanks to all our panelists. I think we've heard extremely valuable views. So it's without doubt that content in the thesis should be made publicly available. There are several enablers for that. There is, of course, the awareness, the capacity building for the researchers and how they can engage with the process. The institutions need their own policies, and these need to be followed through with clear implementation. There could be best practice on technology that is shared across the community. So there are various enablers for this. So a huge thanks once again to all of our panelists. And on that note, I'd like to invite Mr. Nilanjan Sinha from AuthorCafé, the product head at AuthorCafé, to join us. Nilanjan comes with 14 plus years of experience in various roles in the technology industry. And in the last 5 years, he's been working on solving problems in the field of scholarly communication and research management. He's played an active role in building XBio, which is a revolutionary biology learning platform, and Review Central, one of its kind submission and peer review platform products in the past. And he's currently the product head at AuthorCafé and is focused on helping research institutions transform the experience of doing, supervising, and managing PhD programs. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you so much, Savita, for the kind introduction. And this was such a wonderful discussion. Although, to be honest, when we started thinking about doing this webinar, given the emphasis on journal publications, as we all know, we were a little hesitant as how relevant or interesting this topic be for the academic community at large. But after this session, not only that we feel more confident about the need to address some of the underlying issues and expectations from thesis or ETDs in particular, it has become more apparent as how ETD could benefit everyone involved, not just scholars, not just supervisors, but institutions and community and everyone who has something to do with it. So very briefly, I would like to call out some of the key takeaways, because there were so many golden nuggets for us. But I'll very briefly summarize some of the things which I think has left us with a lot of perspectives to think about and act upon. So I think Girish started out by saying thesis is like a personal diary, and it's such a thoughtful and beautiful metaphor. And with your due permission, Girish, we would want to use it in our communication further for the ease of explanation, because I think Dr. Vijay also highlighted that there cannot be a simpler and much clearer explanation of that. So thank you for highlighting that. Then Dr. Vijay highlighted the need of technology and the limitations of PDF format, which was repeated as we went along. And then how new formats like HTML and few others could actually benefit around enhanced interactivity, reproducibility, accessibility. So some of those underlying issues which have become very, very relevant today, and which we keep talking about even in context of journal publications. So that was very interesting to hear about. Then Dr. Momita, she spoke about the practical challenges like what we have with journals or with open science movement. And she said that possibly ETDs can be starting point for open science. And that's again something which we found very interesting. And given our focus on ETDs has left us with a lot to think about and do something about it. So Momita, we would definitely, like I said at the start of it, we might reach out to you for your further inputs and guidance in this direction. Uh, then we heard very interesting perspectives from Dr. Sridhar, where again, he highlighted the needs of formats and how they should support interoperability, which XML or HTML like formats can do. And further, how it can help data mining besides other obvious benefits which were discussed before. Uh, then from Danny, it was very interesting to hear the experience and gradual journey with the ETDs in Australian universities and at Cambridge University, how the evaluation happened, how there were different challenges which you overcame, and then relevance of FAIR principles in context of ETDs. In fact, but Danny, you might know, and the panelists here might know that this year there's a ETD 2022 summit happening in Serbia, which is focused primarily around FAIR principles for ETD. So it becomes all the more relevant in that context. And towards the end, I'm also glad to mention that the efforts of the AuthorCafé team, what we are trying to do is greatly aligned with many of these aspects, because what we are trying to do with AuthorCafé is to make life easier and for everyone who's involved with PhD in different roles, including the academic community, who in a way should become a beneficiary of that. And many of these pointers which were spoke about today, we are trying to address, and then there are new things which we are going to think about. We are going to go back to drawing room and drawing board, and we want to see how we can address some of those. For example, just to call out few, like leveraging the power of modern formats like HTML for making thesis more accessible, interactive, more interoperable, complying with FAIR principles, helping institutions and setting up their whole ETD workflow and thesis repository while respecting some of the sensitivities around data, like Danny was talking about. There could be some complex workflows because of patent and all of that. So those are some of the things which we are trying to do, and few more things here in this context. So yeah, that is what I just wanted to quickly summarize. And there were a lot of takeaways for us. While I'm sure that participants today also must have found today's discussion very, very helpful. But for us at AuthorCafé, it was very enriching and enlightening session. And with that, I would like to close this webinar by sincerely thanking the esteemed panelists, the audience, Dr. Savita, and AuthorCafé and TNQ team for their efforts, time, and presence. Thank you once again. Have a good day.